Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Now, many of you will be aware that I have covered some of the work of historians Wilson and Blackett, and I've also covered in some detail the plight of Wilson and Blackett and the blatant attempts to bury their research, and even once or twice attempts to bury them. The person who first told me about Wilson and Blackett back in 2009 is a man who I have been meaning to interview for some years now. He is a best-selling author, researcher and expert on all things esoteric. Adrian Gilbert. Welcome, Adrian.
Thank you. Lovely to see you, Richard.
Now, we're going to talk about the work that you did with Wilson and Blackett, in particular King Arthur. Mm-hmm. And you co-wrote The Holy Kingdom with Wilson and Blackett, which was published in 97, I think?
98 it was, actually.
98. And then I'm going to ask you about some of your more recent research into the Arthur dynasty after the legendary King Arthur. But I'd just like to start about asking you about Wilson and Blackett themselves. Mm-hmm. And how did you come to be aware of Wilson and Blackett's research?
Well, that's a story in itself, actually. I first read a little article, I think it was in the Sunday Telegraph or something like that, which talked about them in a rather jocular fashion, you know, tongue-in-cheek. And then a little while later, perhaps a couple of months later, I met a clairvoyant, a lady who had been doing some work on the pyramids, which is kind of an area I was very into. And she gave me a reading. Now, I don't normally go to clairvoyants for readings, but she gave me a reading anyway, and she told me very specifically, she said, "You're going to see a cross on a wall, and behind it there's a real one." So I thought, oh, well, that's interesting, because I was about to go to Mexico. Now, I don't know if you know anything about the Maya, but there's a famous city called Palenque, and in that city there's somewhere called the Temple of the Cross, which has a cross on the front of it. So I thought, I'll have a little look behind. Maybe I'll see there's something there, that's what she's on about. So I went to Palenque and I had a look behind and there was nothing there. Mm. And I thought, well, you know, clairvoyants, what can you do with them, you know? So I thought no more about it. And a couple of weeks later, out of the blue, I got a phone call from Alan Wilson.
So this would be in the early, mid-90s?
This would be in 1994,
right.
I think about December, yeah.
Right, okay.
And I'd never met the man. I didn't know anything about him except that article I'd read. But I was curious because, you know, I'm interested in King Arthur. I think we all are. And it had pricked my interest. So we got chatting and I decided I'd go and pay him a visit. He lived in Cardiff at that time. So I went down there to Cardiff with my wife and he showed us, you know, material about his discoveries about King Arthur, which I'm sure we'll be saying more about later. But at the end of our chat, he said, "Oh, I've got something else I want to show you. I've got a little video," and he popped the video in. Mm-hmm. And he said, "You know, this is a sacred cross. It's in Nevern, and it's on a wall." And he said, "We believe that behind it there's a cave, and in the cave is the real cross of Jesus Christ." And I could have fallen off the seat, you know, because, I mean, I didn't know if there's any truth in that. I mean, maybe there isn't. Maybe there is. I don't know. Nobody's actually been in there to find out. But the fact that he raised the idea of a cross on a wall and behind it there's a real one, when a clairvoyant had said the same thing to me just, you know, a couple of months earlier, mm-hmm. It was just an incredible coincidence. So on the basis of that, I decided, well, I'll go further with these guys and I'll see about writing a book with them, which is what they wanted, mm-hmm. which became the Holy Kingdom.
And they showed you very strong evidence, you would say, of King Arthur in South Wales.
Absolutely, yes.
And gradually, or over a certain period, you became more and more convinced by that evidence.
Yes,
and that resulted in the book. Now, I've covered, I would say, predominantly their plight rather than their research.
Right.
And the fact that, I would say that there definitely has been attempts on their lives. And if you want to view the documentation of that, go back and look at some of the TV shows that I've recorded documenting all of the attacks, smear attempts, etc., etc. So I just want to ask you your opinion, Adrian. Why would somebody be attacking these two guys?
Well, I think there's several reasons for that. Depends who's doing the attacking, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to speculate too far, but I know, because I've encountered this in many different areas, there is such a thing as an academic establishment. And it occupies everything. It occupies physics, it occupies Egyptology, it occupies British archaeology. There's a kind of standard status quo, and they uphold that status quo, and they don't want anyone rocking the boat. They don't want new ideas, particularly. And it's always been like that, because if you've become Professor so-and-so, and the basis of you being professor is that you are the expert, if someone comes along and proves that what you know is actually wrong,
Mm-hmm.
suddenly you've lost your credibility. Yeah, suddenly you're just like everyone else, you're having to start again. So people defend their territory bitterly,
Mm-hmm.
and the higher up they are, the more they do defend it. And I've heard it said that the only time you get real change is when people die.
Right.
And I think there's some truth in that. So that's the first level of, antagonism they ran up against.
Right.
But
Academic establishment, but then there's perhaps forces higher than that, you think?
well, there's other forces as well that you have to understand that most of academia these days is sponsored. It's either sponsored by government or by some special interest group. So people get research grants, professorship chairs are paid for, and they have to make sure the money is going to keep coming in. So again, there is a personal need to defend their income because they got children at school, they got mortgages to pay. They don't want to see that disappear. And the third level, I would call corruption.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no doubt about it in my mind that in Wales particularly there's a huge amount of corruption, that you have a political establishment that's been unchanged pretty much for 100 years. It's been run by the same people. And they call them the Tafia or the Tafiosi. And as, we laugh about that. We say, that's a nice pun, isn't it, Tafia? But there is. And these people, they control who gets the grants. They get backsheesh in their back pocket. And there's even people who are doing things which are wrong,
Mm-hmm.
particularly, in archaeology. Wilson told me quite specifically that there were, I'm not going to name names, but there were particular people who were supposedly doing digs, but not doing anything and scattering a few Roman coins around, to make it look like they'd found something.
Right. And what about state involvement or secret society involvement? Because, for example, when their research reached a certain level, they were featured on the 6 o'clock news in 1986 as a main item, and then all of a sudden, jump, it was gone. So that's not the Tafia preventing further programs on that. This is someone who can control what's on the BBC.
Yeah.
So do you think it's at that level?
That happened to me, actually, as well. When we were launching the Holy Kingdom, we had booked for me to come down to Cardiff for an interview with the BBC. And when I arrived, it turned out that, we've got no cameras because Nelson Mandela's here. So, we can't do it.
Right.
We found a camera, it's all right. We'll do an interview with you in the car park, if that's okay with you, Adrian. So
Right.
I don't think there was even a film in the camera.
Right. So if we assume that there is some group which has that kind of power, is that security services? Is it the Crown?
I think the BBC for a start. I have to be careful what I say here.
Right.
But they have an agenda. There's no doubt about it. They have an agenda, and a lot of what you're being fed through the news, through educational programs, current affair programs, even things like a series like Holby City or whatever, that it's not just drama or news or comment, it's done to program you in a specific way with to their agenda. Now, who's dictating that agenda? Whether it's the high-ups in the BBC or whether it's whoever controls the BBC. I mean, they're supposedly a completely separate organisation. And I'm not really a conspiracy person anyway, but I do notice when people are trying to program me to agree with a certain viewpoint. We call it indoctrination. And I mean, Dr. Goebbels would be delighted. You know, he would say, yeah, these are my disciples.
Yeah.
But it's all, and we pay for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Well,
incredible.
some of us pay for it. Now, and when the Holy Kingdom was first published, because we are going to go into some of this research in a moment, you were surprised at how quickly the print runs were being closed down. Yeah. So just tell us about that.
Well, I'll tell you about the Holy Kingdom, right. Now, I'd had 3 books, there are 2 in the top 10 before. The Orion Mystery went up to number 1 in non-fiction, which is pretty remarkable for when you're writing esoteric alternative history that goes against the grain of the establishment. To get your book that high up was remarkable. The My Own Prophecies book, I followed that up with. That I got number 5, I think. And the book I did after that, Magi, that got to about number 16. So I had 3 books which were top 20 bestsellers in this genre of non-fiction. And remember, you're up against all the cookbooks, the celebrity biographies, all of them, you know. So to get into the top 20 is remarkable. So when the Holy Kingdom came out, you can imagine the publishers were very happy with me. They wanted the book to succeed. They spent a lot of money on it. The production values and the printing, it's done very well. And the book, it got up to, I think, about number 17 or something like that. It did okay. I mean, it wasn't, sort of flying off the shelves, but it was doing well. And there was no reason to think that it would not continue to sell, and gradually the sales would build over time. Because it's such a fascinating area, and what we were saying was completely new.
And this was research based on Wilson and Blackett's, 20 previous years of Dark Age British history, the Arthurian king.
Well, I'd been through their research with a fine-tooth comb, and I'd tidied things up, and I'd checked things, and I'd been very meticulous in putting it all together and then presenting it in a form which is digestible, because, when you write a book, it's got to be entertaining and digestible as well as informative. Yeah. So that was really what I was there for to do, but it was basically their research. So we were all hopeful and expecting, and it was doing reasonably well. It was in all the shops, like Waterstones and the Dillons were around at that time. It was in Lears in Cardiff. It was doing very well. It was in all the shops. And that was in the hardback, and then it went into those days we had book club editions as well, so it did that as well. So I was optimistic. I thought this book's going to be all right. Well, within 9 months, they announced that they wanted to discontinue the hardback. Well, I thought, well, this is a little premature, but yeah, I can understand. Perhaps they feel that they've made their hardback sales. They don't want to, have the excess stock littering up the warehouse. The publishers are realistic that way. So, okay, well, it's going into paperback. So it went into paperback, and again, it went into the top 20. Doing all right, And that was the sort of book I would expect to carry on ticking over year by year, making sales, maybe even getting some momentum.
No. It's hardly time sensitive, is it?
It's hardly time sensitive, and it's the sort of thing that you would expect to become a standard, work on the subject. Well, again, within 9 months, they took that off the shelves. It was as though within 18 months they'd killed that book.
Right. So you think it's possible, although you don't know, that the publisher was put under pressure or maybe paid off by someone high up? You think it's possible?
It's possible that someone put some pressure. And I mean, I'm reminded of the Velikovsky affair. Do you know anything about the
No.
Velikovsky affair? Well, Emanuel Velikovsky was a very famous author of a book called Worlds in Collision. It was published in 1950 originally, and it was about how Venus, the planet Venus, had come out of Jupiter as a comet and come very close to the Earth and caused all manner of catastrophes and ending dinosaurs and so on before it eventually settled down in its orbit. Highly controversial. Some of what he had to say, I think he made some good arguments. Some I think was pretty fanciful. Mm-hmm. But, you know, he did present a very interesting alternative view. But it really upset the establishment. I mean, when I say upset, really upset. It was published, I think, it was either Cambridge or Oxford University Press who published it originally, I think. I might be wrong on that. Their other authors told the publishers that if they did not pull that book, they were never going to give them another book to publish.
Right.
Now, these are academic publishers. Their lifeblood is academics having their books published by them. They couldn't afford to take a stance over Velikovsky.
Right.
So they discontinued his book. Mm-hmm. Of course, that was the best thing possible for him because he went round, I think it was the Souvenir Press or someone, and got them to do it, and it was a bestseller. But it shows you that book burning is not something that only happened hundreds of years ago.
Right.
You step out of line too far, and there are people that will, you know, make sure that book goes, and it still happens now.
Mm-hmm. So the Holy Kingdom put forward the argument that King Arthur was a 6th century king who resided in Glamorgan, and there was also another previous King Arthur a few hundred years earlier who fought against the Romans. Yeah. And it's an evidence-based book. You're looking at ancient stones and various manuscripts, which put forward this argument. Now, I'm just, for those who don't have any knowledge of history, Adrian, because your more recent book goes through other eras, the medieval eras and more up to date from the Arthurian line.
I followed it right up to the present in that book, the dynasty.
Yes. So just can we have a little timeline and just a summary of when did the Romans first come to Britain?
Right.
And how long did their empire last? And can we say when Anglo-Saxons came and Normans came? Just give us a rough overview.
Right, I'll give you an overview. The first time the Romans came here was Julius Caesar. He came to Kent in 55 BC. And basically he was kicked out twice. He doesn't admit that in his book, De Bello Gallico. He says he had tributes and slaves. And he makes a case that he did all right. But the reality is that the Romans didn't come back for 80 years.
Right.
Then in 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius, who wanted to prove himself, made a second invasion, and this time they were successful. They conquered very quickly the southeast of England, and then they had more trouble as they went into Wales. So that was in 43 AD. And then in 410, the Romans withdrew from Britain. That's the normal date that's given. There was trouble at home. You know, Rome was under attack from Visigoths and Huns and people like this. So they pulled their armies back. So, you know, you Brits, you're going to have to look after yourselves from now on. And of course the Brits, they didn't know about the military thing. Their young men had all been taken away by the Romans in their army, you know. So it's just the old men and boys left behind.
Right.
So
they were here for about 400 years in force.
Roughly, yeah.
Yeah, right.
So then the Romans left, and then initially there was a guy called Vortigern. I'm not going to go into this in detail. There was a guy called Vortigern, and he invited the Anglo-Saxons to come and defend Britain from pirates and invaders, particularly the Picts from Scotland, but also from other tribes trying to invade. And this was actually quite a common thing in the Roman Empire, that they employed what were called federati, or federates, who would work with them, be paid by them as mercenaries, basically, to do, you know, the fighting for them. So that's how the Anglo-Saxons arrived in. They first came in 448 BC, AD. Mm-hmm. There's a famous guy, Hengist and Horsa, and I've done a lot of research on them. So that's your Anglo-Saxons. That's how that began. And then you end up with your Anglo-Saxons rebellion against the Britons fighting back. King Arthur comes around about in the 6th century, and there's some argument about exactly his dates. Maybe 5th century for Arthur I, as they call him. We believe that there were 2 Arthurs and their careers got mixed up. Arthur I perhaps was an earlier warrior in the southwest of England. Arthur II is this Welsh guy that we're interested in, and he's the one connected with Camelot and the Holy Grail and all of that, the legend. And he's sort of mid-6th century.
Right.
So then you have the Normans who come around 1066.
Yeah.
So
it's a very famous date, obviously.
Yeah.
So this is when the Norman conquest.
Yeah.
So they took over large parts of England, but
Normans conquered. Well, they were lucky. England was the best organised state in Europe at the time. You know, it was a very wealthy state. It had a king. It had a working bureaucracy. So, and they had a sort of pretty centralised church. So all they had to do was defeat the king, arrow through the eye, Harold, you remember?
Yeah.
And take over.
Let me just interrupt you there, Adrian. But to the west, in Wales, there was still a dynasty of another kingdom.
Different story.
Another kingdom, if you like, that was not being controlled by the Saxons or
wasn't being it was a number of kingdoms and warring little
between
factions,
themselves. Yeah.
So it wasn't a centralised state that they could just walk in, take out one man and take over.
Right.
It was a much more piecemeal, difficult.
Right.
So, and plus it's mountainous, you know, whereas England, certainly the south of England, was relatively easy.
Right. But at some point the Normans did eventually take over Cardiff.
Eventually, 1092 roughly.
1092, so that's a few years after the 1066 date.
Yeah.
But they didn't get the whole of Wales, did they?
No.
So can you...
Yeah. Well, even in Glamorgan, which is it's the Vale of Glamorgan that they seized, and a guy called Sir Robert Fitzhammond, who was the Earl of Gloucester, originally came as an ally to the King of Glamorgan, who was fighting another battle with another king in the southwest of Wales, in Dyfed. And once they'd won that battle and the Normans pretended to step down and go home, they just put their ships over the horizon, waited till the Welsh had stood down, because they only had a peasant army, you know, they're not permanent soldiers. They came back, seized the castle, captured King Iestyn ap Gurgen, Cardiff Castle, the other castles of the Vale, and divided the spoils up among themselves. But there were other parts, particularly up in the valleys, that were not taken, that were still Welsh. And it took a long time before they were able to get hold of those bits and pieces.
Now, the dynasties that were there before the Normans came, they're going back maybe 1,500 years?
Yeah, something like that.
To Brutus?
Their claim is that they're descended from Brutus.
Right.
And that's another whole story that I could talk to you for hours about this, but the ancient British histories, when you actually read our history, not what archaeologists dig up and decide must be the history, but the actual written history that people believed.
Right, now, we had to take a short break there because Adrian suffered a nosebleed, which I think is rather ironic with the title of his book, The Blood of Avalon.
The Blood of Adrian.
Yeah, The Blood of Adrian. But he's okay.
Yeah, I've had to change my shirt.
Okay, let's continue with Arthur then. So Arthur, is disputed by some people as coming from South Wales, 6th century king, and there were numerous dynasties in Wales, Adrian. There's a bit more infighting, and just give us a picture of the difference between, say, Wales and what was happening in England.
Okay, well, England had been a unified kingdom really since about the time of King Athelstan, that we're talking about back in the 9th century. And prior to him, I think it was his grandfather, was a famous king called Alfred, who defeated the Vikings. And had he not done that, we'd all be speaking Swedish now, or Danish. but he defeated the Vikings and saved Wessex, the southwest corner of England, and gradually increased his kingdom to include Mercia, which is the Midlands, particularly the West Midlands, and Kent and London.
And he was big on Christianity.
Very big on Christianity. He himself learnt Latin and wrote prayers and translated stuff, and very big on education.
So I've heard people say it's the birth of the English nation.
Absolutely.
Right.
So Alfred the Great, I mean, when he was around, initially he had problems. You know, the Danes invaded from the north, defeated Northumbrian king and then the East Anglian king, and they had a trick where they'd open the guy's chest up and take his heart out. You know,
Really?
They call that a blood angel,
Right.
Blood eagle.
Right.
And that was, you know, they were going to do that to Alfred as well, but he although he lost the first battle at Chippenham, he retreated into the Fenlands near Glastonbury, on an island called Athelney, which means the island of the prince. And afterwards, he gathered his men together on the borderland of Dorset and Somerset and Wiltshire and Hampshire, around that area, just north of Shaftesbury. And they fought a big battle against the Danes near Westbury, where the White Horse is now, and defeated them. So I believe a lot of the so-called Glastonbury legends about King Arthur is really a memory of King Alfred, who did very similar things and was actually associated with that area.
Mm-hmm.
And it was his grandson, I think he was a grandson, Edgar, founded Glastonbury Abbey.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that this was the real Glastonbury, Avalon, Avalac of in Welsh literature is farcical. It wasn't.
Yeah.
That was somewhere else entirely. But they wanted to bring the legend to England. Mm-hmm. And so that's why a guy called Dunstan, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury later on, he was the first abbot of Glastonbury. He was a close friend of Edgar. And when they did digs in Glastonbury during the First World War, they did a massive dig on the cathedral ruins. They could find nothing earlier there than a sort of chapel of rest for King Edgar from 940. So there was no kind of old wattle church. There was none of all this so-called stuff that connects it with Joseph Arimathea. There were no tombs there. If you went there now, had this been the original real Glastonbury, you'd expect to find inscribed stones, written either in Latin or in the old British tongue. There's none of that there. Go to Wales and you find loads of that kind of stuff.
So Glastonbury, for some reason, became attached to Arthur, or the Arthurian myth.
Yes.
And but you just think that, well,
That happened slightly later.
You think there was some propaganda involved with certain monks,
yes,
to create that. Just to explain that.
Well, there was a serious fire at Glastonbury Abbey. I think it's around about 1100. My dates might be out on that. But anyway, it's the time of Edward I. You've heard of Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots and so on. He was also the Hammer of the Welsh. And he seized on, the monks had a big fire, and then they claimed to have dug around and they found the bones of this tall man and a lead slab saying, "This is King Arthur, the once and future king." And so he decided, that's a great idea, and had a big shrine built for Arthur, and it put up near the high altar in what was now Glastonbury Abbey. So pilgrims would flock there, to see the shrine of Arthur. Mm-hmm. Brought a lot of wealth to the abbey, which grew and grew and grew.
Right.
So that's where that comes from, and it was really a political propaganda, because within Welsh legend, there's this prophecy that Arthur will come again, right? The once and future king.
Right.
So people expecting that he's not dead, he's going to come back.
Right.
Well, Edward could say, look, he's not coming anywhere. These bones are in there.
Right.
Get him out of there,
Right.
He's dead.